In 1935, an executive at a company called Asbestos Manhattan wrote a letter to the corporate council of Johns Manville, the largest asbestos manufacturer on Earth, and in that letter he made a simple request. He asked that a magazine article about workers dying from asbestos exposure be quietly suppressed. The other executive agreed. That letter still exists. It sits today in court archives, one of thousands of documents that would eventually reveal the darkest fact in industrial history, that the men selling asbestos knew with clinical certainty that their product was killing the people who mined it, wove it, installed it, and lived near it. And they kept selling it for another 50 years. Asbestos was never a modern invention. It is a naturally occurring silicate mineral that grows in long, fibrous crystals inside serpentine rock, and human beings have been fascinated by it for at least 4,000 years. In ancient Persia, wealthy families used cloth, woven from asbestos fibers, to wrap the bodies of the dead before cremation, believing the flame-resistant shroud would keep the ashes separate and pure. Romans wove it into tablecloths and threw them into fires after dinner to clean them, watching the food stains burn away while the fabric emerged whiter than before. They called it amiantus, meaning unstained. Charlemagne is said to have amazed visiting Frankish nobles by cleaning a tablecloth the same way, convincing them it was a miracle. But even in antiquity, something was noticed. A Roman writer observed that the slaves who wove asbestos into cloth suffered from a strange sickness of the lungs and died young. A Greek geographer mentioned that these workers wore a thin membrane of goat bladder over their mouths to protect themselves from the dust. Ancient sources described symptoms that today would be immediately recognized as advanced asbestosis, the shortness of breath, the persistent cough, the wasting of otherwise young workers who had spent years handling the mysterious fiber. The connection between the miraculous cloth and the ruined bodies of the people who touched it was already visible 2,000 years ago. It was recorded, and then it was forgotten, because the amount of asbestos being handled in the ancient world was small, artisanal, limited to the very wealthy who could afford such a curiosity. That changed completely in the late 19th century. In 1876, enormous deposits of chrysotile asbestos were discovered in the mountains of Quebec, near what would become a town literally named Asbestos, Canada. Within 20 years, industrial-scale mining had begun, and by 1900, the material had become the miracle of the age. It was cheap, abundant, and remarkably strong. It could be woven into cloth, mixed into cement, sprayed onto steel, packed into pipes, layered into brake pads, pressed into roof tiles, and sprinkled into over 3,000 different industrial products. It could resist fire, insulate against heat, absorb sound, and last for decades without degrading. In the industrial imagination, it was almost magic. By the 1920s, asbestos was everywhere. It insulated the boilers of every warship in the British and American navies, lined the walls of schools and hospitals, and coated the pipes of every steam heating system in the industrial world. It was mixed into floor tiles, spray painted onto ceilings, and packed around every furnace in every factory. Shipyards used it by the ton, and railroads packed it into every locomotive. Some brands of talcum powder contained trace amounts of it. Some brands of cigarettes used asbestos filters in the early 1950s, and even the fireproof curtains hanging on theater stages were often woven from asbestos cloth. Construction workers handled it with bare hands and breathed the dust without a second thought because they had been told, over and over, that it was completely safe. The first modern death that could not be ignored happened in 1924. Her name was Nellie Kershaw, and she was 33 years old. She had worked since childhood in an English asbestos textile mill, spinning raw fibers into yarn, and she died with her lungs so scarred and hardened by inhaled fibers that she could barely draw breath in her final weeks. The pathologist who examined her body gave the condition a new name, pulmonary asbestosis. Her employer refused to pay compensation because, they argued, the disease was so new it had no legal status. The court agreed, and her family received nothing. But her autopsy report was published, and it landed like a stone in the water of European industrial medicine. 6 years later, in 1930, the British government commissioned a study known as the Merewether Report. It examined workers in the country's asbestos textile mills and found that more than a quarter of them showed signs of the same lung disease that had killed Nellie Kershaw. The report was published and read across the industrial world. And here begins the part of the story that no one who worked in the asbestos industry would ever be able to explain away, because from this moment forward, ignorance became impossible. The companies knew, the insurance actuaries knew, the medical departments knew, and the machinery kept running. In the United States, Johns Manville had by then become the dominant asbestos manufacturer on the planet. Its executives received the Merewether report, and they commissioned their own internal studies through the 1930s that confirmed the same conclusion. Workers exposed to asbestos dust developed a scarring lung disease that killed them years or decades after their first exposure. By the mid-1930s, another discovery emerged from a separate line of research. Asbestos fibers were also linked to lung cancer. The mineral did not merely scar the lungs, it transformed them into something that would eventually kill. This is where the Sumner-Simpson letters enter the story. Sumner-Simpson was the president of Asbestos Manhattan. Vandiver Brown was the corporate counsel of Johns Manville. Between 1935 and the early 1940s, the two men exchanged a series of letters that would, decades later, form the backbone of some of the largest civil lawsuits in American history. In those letters, they discussed how to prevent damaging research from reaching the public. They arranged with the editor of a leading industrial medicine journal to allow the companies to review and approve any article about asbestos before publication. They agreed to fund research at prestigious universities on the condition that the results would remain the property of the companies and could be suppressed if inconvenient. The strategy was simple, and it would be repeated by many industries afterward. The tobacco companies would copy it in the 1950s. The sugar industry would copy it in the 1960s. The fossil fuel industry would copy it in the 1980s, and the opioid manufacturers would copy it in the 1990s. Fund the science, control the science, bury what you do not like, publish what you do, and create doubt where there is certainty. Delay regulation for as many years as possible, because every year of delay is another year of profit. And every year of profit is worth thousands of lives, statistically speaking. Those lives are diffuse, spread across decades, difficult to prove in any individual case. And the math worked in the industry's favor for as long as no one could see the whole picture. By the 1940s, the wartime demand for asbestos was extraordinary. Shipyards on both coasts of the United States insulated the hulls of thousands of Navy vessels with sprayed asbestos, and hundreds of thousands of workers breathed the dust for years without any protection. Their employers knew what would happen to them, and the medical files still exist to prove it. Company doctors performed chest x-rays on workers, identified the early signs of asbestosis, and were instructed by management not to inform the workers of what they had found. In one internal memo from the period, a corporate medical director wrote that as long as a man was still able to work, telling him about his lung condition would only worry him unnecessarily and might cause him to file a claim. The same doctors who might have saved lives by warning their patients were, by contract and by paycheck, forbidden from doing so. The delayed nature of the disease is what allowed the deception to last so long. Asbestos-related cancers, particularly the rare and vicious cancer called mesothelioma, do not appear immediately after exposure. They typically appear 20, 30, sometimes 40 years later. A young man breathing dust in a shipyard in 1943 would not develop his fatal cancer until 1975. By then he would be retired, perhaps, living in a different state, his connection to the original exposure buried under decades of other work and life. The corporate lawyers understood this timing perfectly, and they knew that most victims would die before they could ever prove where they had gotten sick. The wall of silence finally broke in 1964. A doctor at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York published a study of asbestos insulation workers that established, with statistical clarity so overwhelming it could not be dismissed, that these men were dying of lung cancer and mesothelioma at rates far above the general population. The study reached the front page of newspapers, then Congress, and then the general public, and within a few years the first great wave of asbestos litigation began. Thousands of workers, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, filed suit against the industry, and the internal company documents were subpoenaed. The Sumner-Simpson letters came into the light, and for the first time the world could read in plain typewritten English, exactly what the men in charge had known and when they had known it. Johns Manville, at that point the largest asbestos manufacturer in the world, declared bankruptcy in 1982 rather than pay the mounting judgments. It was the first major corporation to use the bankruptcy system as a shield against health claims from its own products. The company reorganized itself, created a trust fund for victims, and continued to exist under a slightly different name. Similar bankruptcies followed across the industry as one manufacturer after another chose insolvency over accountability. To this day, more than 100 companies have filed for bankruptcy protection because of asbestos liability, and the trust funds set aside for victims total more than $30 billion. You might assume that once the truth came out, the material was banned everywhere immediately. It was not. Iceland became the first country to ban asbestos in 1983, followed by Sweden, then Germany, France, and eventually most of Europe. The United Kingdom did not fully ban the material until 1999, and the European Union did not impose a complete ban until 2005. The United States, the largest consumer of asbestos in the 20th century, did not enact a full ban on the most common form, chrysotile asbestos, until 2024, nearly 90 years after the industry's own scientists had confirmed that the material caused fatal disease. Even now, in 2026, the material has not disappeared. It sits behind the walls of hundreds of thousands of commercial buildings and millions of older homes across the United States alone, lining the pipes of schools built in the 1950s and 1960s, hidden in the floor tiles of hospitals, the roof shingles of homes, and the insulation of aging apartment buildings. Whenever those buildings are renovated or demolished, the fibers are released into the air. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 200,000 people still die every year from asbestos-related diseases, and that number will not begin to fall meaningfully until the 2040s, because the exposures of the 1970s and 1980s are still working their way through human bodies. Russia, meanwhile, is today the largest producer of asbestos in the world. The town of Asbestos in the Ural Mountains is built directly around an open pit mine of chrysotile fiber so vast it is visible from space. The residents live with the dust in the air on the streets, in their windowsills, and a fine gray coating settles overnight on every parked car and every laundry line. Their cancer rates are among the highest in Russia. The mine continues to operate, exporting its product to India, China, and other developing economies where regulations remain weaker and where the material continues to be woven into the fabric of new construction, condemning another generation of workers to fatal diseases that will not appear until decades from now. What is the single fact from this entire story that you find most disturbing? That the ancients already noticed the sickness 2,000 years ago, that company doctors deliberately hid diagnoses from their own workers, or that the material remains legal in dozens of countries even now? Leave your answer in the comments below, because this is the kind of history that becomes different when 100,000 people are having the same conversation about it. The reason the story of asbestos matters is not simply that a mineral killed millions of people. It matters because it established a template. The pattern the asbestos executives created in the 1930s: fund the science, control the publication, delay the regulation, wait out the victims, became the operating manual of every industry that has ever discovered its own product to be dangerous. Tobacco followed it precisely, and so did leaded gasoline, sugar, and processed food, and the opioid manufacturers who reshaped American medicine. The forever chemicals now saturating the world's water supply are following it right now, with the same paid research, the same friendly editors, and the same convenient uncertainties introduced into the scientific record at exactly the moments when regulation might have been possible. Every time a corporation discovers that its most profitable product is quietly harming the people who use it, the same playbook is dusted off, and the same decades of delay are purchased at the same price of human lives. The next time you walk into an old building and see those white ceiling tiles, or those textured walls sprayed with what looks like popcorn, or those pipes wrapped in strange fibrous cloth, remember what you are looking at. You are looking at the physical residue of a lie that lasted almost a century. You are looking at the reason a mineral used by the Romans became the industrial disease of the modern world. and you are looking at the reason why. Whenever a company today insists that its product is completely safe and there's nothing to worry about, a careful person always asks who paid for the study, when it was published, and what the internal memo said. If this story of hidden science and delayed justice held your attention, subscribe, so the next investigation into how industries have shaped the world you live in reaches you the moment it goes live. And send this to the friend who is always asking why the world sometimes feels rigged against ordinary people. Because the answer, more often than not, is written in letters like the ones Sumner Simpson wrote in 1935